So what's at stake for Australia and also our region? We can speak now to Tony Wood, who is the Energy and Climate Program Director at Grattan Institute. We're also joined by Tess Newton Cain, who is the project leader for the Griffith Asia Institute's Pacific Hub at Griffith University. Welcome to you both. Great to have you on. We heard in that story by Michael Slezak that this is one of the most important summits yet on the environment. But as far as Australia goes, we're trailing other countries. Tony Wood, the plan that the Prime Minister is taking to Glasgow, to the international stage, does it make Australia a genuine and credible player on the world stage when it comes to climate change?
Well, you'd heard from Professor Hughes that many people would say no. The big difference from where it was only a week ago is that Australia has now committed to net zero by 2050. So we've got ourselves into the club, got through the front door, if you like, into the club. The challenge is that just achieving net zero by 2050 now is considered generally from an environmental perspective not to be enough. So we've got a plan. Unfortunately, the plan is mostly around how we develop technologies that won't really have to have an impact on emissions until the 2030s and 2040s, whereas we need to be doing stuff now, most of which is actually achievable and affordable for Australia, and that's where the pressure is going to be on. I don't think that we'll have to, I don't think the Prime Minister is going to back off, but it will be an awkward place, although it's better than it was a week ago.
Tess Newton Cain, the Pacific Island leaders have for many, many years now pleaded for developing nations, one, for help, and two, to reduce their emissions targets, because of course the Pacific community is the canary in the mine, aren't they? They're the ones that will be feeling the rise in waters. They're the ones that's feeling the impact of global warming. Do you think this is the summit that will make a real difference, that their pleas will finally be heard?
Well, I think we can certainly hope for that. And as you say, this is a campaign that has been at the forefront of Pacific thinking for many, many years. And obviously one of the challenges that Pacific leaders face this time around is that given that the conference is being held in Glasgow and with all the limitations arising out of COVID, the number of Pacific delegations is much smaller than might have been hoped. So a number of countries have not been able to send delegations at all. They're hoping to be able to join some sessions virtually, but in terms of actually being there present in the room or the rooms, that's going to be quite difficult for them. But I think certainly it's been made very clear by Pacific leaders, both at national and regional level, by voices from civil society, from this new grouping that we've seen emerge just in the last couple of days, the Pacific Elders, that this is really, they see this as the last chance for the global community to really step up and deliver on promises that have been made previously.
All right, but on that point, we heard earlier from US President Joe Biden, who addressed the Pacific Island Forum this year, promising to reduce his nation's emissions. With that voice in support, do you think there will be more of a change?
Well, certainly, I think that you've made a really important point that now the Pacific can look to some really big hitters that have said that they will support them. We've heard very strong commitments from the US, from the European Union, from the UK, that really do measure up to what the Pacific leadership has been calling for. And certainly one of the strengths of the Pacific delegations and one of their tricks of the trade is to build what might be called coalition diplomacy. My colleague George Carter refers to it as that. And so they've already had meetings with the Association of Small Island States and the group of G77. So they're very, very adept at building and sustaining coalitions of trust, coalitions of ambition, and they'll be using those levers to good effect, I'm sure, over the next few days.
Tony Wood, you spoke earlier about the importance of technology, and that's something we've certainly heard from the government as well. And they're relying on future technological advancements that haven't actually happened yet. Is that a safe bet? And do we have the framework and the incentives in place to create an environment where that might happen?
Well, I think it's one of these situations where language can be very important. The part of the answer is that technology is necessary if we're going to address climate change. Across the entire economy, there are all sorts of areas where technology will be essential. However, the problem is that that's only a third of the story. Technology is not enough. As we do, I'm sure we will, reduce the costs of some of these emissions-reducing technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, such as hydrogen, such as ways of dealing with emissions from cows, we have to deploy those. They have to be actually adopted in these situations where they can be applied. And unless there's some form of structural incentive or penalty to cause people to adopt these technologies, it simply won't happen. So we need both. We need the technologies to be developed rapidly, and we need the policies and financial markets to deliver them, and also to deliver to those developing countries the financial contribution that the developed countries committed to some years ago now, over $100 billion a year, and we haven't done that either yet. So there's a lot to be done. And of course, the other thing is that we need to work out how we're going to allow trading of carbon credits. So that's a big deal for Australia. It's a big deal there. Technology is essential. It's not enough.
That is an interesting point, Tess Newton Cain. If you could speak to that, technology is not enough, but I saw you nodding there on the point of funds being needed by the Pacific Island community as well. Where would those funds go? We know that they've been asking for, people to contribute more to help them shore up their defences against the impact of climate change. But where would those funds go?
Well, I think the reason for the funding is, there are several parts to this. So, there's basic sort of infrastructure, like building seawalls. A few years ago, I was in Majuro and I stood on a retaining wall that had been built with funding from Taiwan by the mayor of Majuro. And he said to me, before we had this wall, Tess, I would stand here, and when the king tides came, the bones of my ancestors would be washed out to sea. And now the wall stops that. So, it's basic things like that. But at the other end, or in another part of the spectrum, is you need to remember that countries in the Pacific, Vanuatu is rated by the World Bank as the most at risk from natural disasters. When Cyclone Pam hit Vanuatu in 2015, the damage caused was equivalent to 64% of the country's GDP. So when you're being hit by those cyclones that big, more frequently, you're always in recovery. You're never getting ahead. You're constantly rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding livelihoods, rebuilding the economy. And so these countries were already disadvantaged in terms of participation in the global economy. And then with the impact of having to build resilience against disasters, having to relocate communities because where they live is no longer safe, it's a constant drain. It's a constant drain on resources. And the position of the Pacific is increasingly, well, we didn't create this problem. You need to pay for this. And I think, as well as the $100 billion funding that Tony's referred to, another aspect that the Pacific want to see on the agenda, and I think a number of people are quite disheartened that it's not, is the issue of loss and damage. So how are big emitters in the global economy going to compensate countries like the Marshall Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, all of these countries that are already suffering the impacts of climate change?
Tony Wood, taking a broad view of this and looking at this summit and where the international community is moving on this, and particularly on important countries like China, for example, what needs to be the end result from this Glasgow Climate Summit?
Well, the risk, of course, is that, as always, we end up with a plan for a plan, or new commitments that don't happen. And you've got to remember that the Paris Agreement was very different from what had come before. The idea of the Paris Agreement was for every country individually to make their pledges or their commitments to achieving the objective, which was this 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degree rise in temperature. Remembering that since this all started, temperatures have already gone up 1.1 degrees from pre-industrial levels anyway, so we're getting pretty close. So what has to happen here is that the countries together have to effectively put something in the hat when it's passed around. I mean, basically, it's a little like that. They will all sit in a room. The people running the conference, this time it's the UK who are the host, will say, look, here's all your contributions. This is what we've got. this is what we have to get. It's not enough.
Tess
Now,
Newton,
that's the trick.
apologies, Tony Wood, but we are running out of time, and I want to get this point through. Tess Newton Cain, it's more than funding. It's also about regional security, isn't it? Because in your op-ed in August, you wrote that Australia's inability or refusal to be part of the team when it comes to climate change is undermining Australia's entire Pacific step-up. Are you suggesting that less cooperation would then mean a bigger power like China would be able to step in and have more influence in the Pacific?
I think it's important not to be too binary and too simplistic about it, but I think increasingly what we've seen from the Pacific leadership, coming from all different directions, is just an increasing lack of patience with the Australian position. When Scott Morrison announced this commitment to net zero the other week, he effectively verbaled the Pacific and said, oh, they're going to strongly welcome this. They haven't strongly welcomed it. They've made it very clear that they don't consider it sufficient. Australia is a party to the Boy Declaration, which is the most recent statement on regional security, and it states quite clearly that the number one threat faced by the region is climate change, and all members are expected to be doing the best that they can to meet that challenge. Now, I think Australia needs to take a long look at itself and ask itself, are we doing the best that we can? Certainly, Pacific leaders do have other partners that they can talk to. They do talk to China about climate change. They've made calls on greater ambition from China and the rest of the global community. But Australia really needs to realise that this is the number one red line issue for the Pacific.
There is so much riding on COP26 in Glasgow. You know, we keep hearing this is the last chance. This is the last chance for the globe to get together and do something about this. Before COP26, though, we have leaders of the world's richest nations meeting in Rome for the G20 at the moment. Now, I read that there is a draft communique suggesting that leaders will, and I'm going to quote here, commit to tackling the existential threat of climate change. Now, there's no deadline. There's no timeline that's being mentioned here to achieve carbon neutrality. And we've got the leaders of the richest nations who can't seem to get a consensus on how to act on climate change. Will COP26, Tony Wood, if I could address this question to you, will COP26 is just basically a talk fest?
Well, yes and no. It is a talk fest, but it's an important talk fest because people do get together, and as was preempted in the introduction to this conversation, that you're getting together and mutually agreeing is very important. The problem is that I think the point you made is likely to mean that this is going to be underwhelming because it requires all these countries to make much stronger pledges, and they'll have to add up. I don't expect them that they will. I expect we will see some further development. I hope we'll see the money that's been promised will come. And I hope we'll see a better way for developed countries to contribute more to the problems of developing countries. I'd be very surprised if we actually see a commitment which will line up with the 1.5 degrees, let alone 2 degrees, that's been very much clearly identified as what we have to achieve.
All right. On that note, we're going to have to end this very interesting, fascinating discussion. But we thank you both for sharing both your insights and expertise with us, Tony Wood and Tess Newton Cain.